Hi, On Orbit listeners. Welcome to the last episode of On Orbit for 2024. I can't believe how fast this year has gone, and we're back doing another year in review. It seems like there's never a slow news day in the space and satellite industry, and there's a lot to talk about from 2024, from SES's acquisition of Intelsat, Starlink's commercial wins, challenges at some of the biggest manufacturers, and new launch vehicles coming online. I'm here with my fellow editors, Mark Holmes, editor-in-chief of Via Satellite, and Jeff Hill, executive editor and chair of The Satellite Show. We're going to talk about some of the biggest developments of 2024 with operators, manufacturers, and launch, and why these are the critical stories that we'll be developing in 2025. Mark and Jeff, thanks so much for joining me for another year in review.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you for the invitation today, and looking forward to a good discussion as always with you and Jeff.
Thanks for having us, Rachel. It's good to be here.
Yes. All right, so I'm going to kick us off with the operator market. We'll start with the operators first. So we continue to see more consolidation in 2024 with the end of the will they, won't they, SES and Intelsat merger acquisition. So SES is acquiring Intelsat. The deal is supposed to close next year. So if that goes through, we'll have four big satellite operators: SES, Intelsat, Viasat, Inmarsat, now Viasat, Starlink, and Eutelsat with the OneWeb constellation. We saw Starlink continue to get some more impressive wins in 2024. Early in the year, it was John Deere with the news that Starlink won the deal to equip tractors with broadband, and then United Airlines in France in the aviation market in the second half of the year. And then at the same time, SpaceX was also launching the first shell of the direct-to-cell constellation and recently got an important FCC approval for that service. With Viasat and Inmarsat, and Eutelsat OneWeb, those companies completed their mergers previously before this year, and we haven't seen major growth from those operators yet. This past year, Viasat has still been dealing with loss of capacity from the first Viasat 3 satellite, but they're now getting closer to launching the second and third Viasat 3 satellite. And at OneWeb, we also saw them have some delays to really roll out the full service of OneWeb, and they had to cut their guidance a little bit this year, so it's taking a little bit more time than planned. And we've also got other LEO constellations on the horizon. We thought Kuiper would start launching this year, but that's been pushed back a little bit to 2025. And Telesat LEO is now moving into the manufacturing phase. So that's kind of a summary of some of the big movements at the operators this year. Mark, you and I both interviewed Intelsat CEO David Waisgrass together and SES CEO Adel Al-Saleh. And you've covered these companies, more than anybody in the industry. Why do you think 2024 was the year that SES and Intelsat finally made the decision to combine?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think there was always a momentum for them to combine. I think, what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is when a new CEO has come in from outside of the industry, that's usually happened. There's usually been a very quick move that followed. So, you go back to Inmarsat with Rajiv Suri becoming the CEO, and then all of a sudden the Viasat Inmarsat combination happens. Eva Bernicke became CEO of Eutelsat, and literally within a few months they'd bought OneWeb. So I think as soon as you saw that Adele was appointed the CEO of SES, the odds of a deal suddenly became a lot smaller. It just seems that's something that we saw happen with the two other deals. It seemed like it was going to happen here. I mean, so I think it was to no one's surprise that this was announced and this deal was announced. I think what's interesting to me is that you talk about the different global players now, and we've still got one or two that are, Kuiper that hasn't launched. We still yet to see Telesat LEO as well. you do have to wonder, whether there is enough business all round for all of them. And I think some of the consolidation is driven by that. Yes, it's always interesting to talk about new markets and agriculture, some of the mobility markets, but it's still fundamentally the government defense markets that are underpinning a lot of this. So I think from SES and Intelsat's perspective, it made a lot of sense. In most industries like satellites, you don't tend to see seven or eight global players. I think the move is usually to the three, four, five, and I think this was just another move in that regard. It's an interesting one because obviously they're going to have very strong geo assets, and they obviously have some MEO as well, and Intelsat's worked with Eutelsat OneWeb as well. So it'll be interesting how that combination of assets shakes out. You mentioned about the deals that Starlink has done. SES will point to one or two that they've done with open orbits, and Intelsat will also point to some of the ones that it's done with airlines as well. So, I still think there are a lot of deals out there in play for all of these companies. But to go back to your original question, was it a surprise? I don't think any of us thought it was a surprise. I think once Adele became CEO, I think we all thought that this potentially could happen. And history has told us in the last 3 years that when you get a new CEO from outside the industry, these moves tend to happen fairly quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, Starlink is really what has been driving that consolidation that the operators need to consolidate, come together, have a much bigger company to be able to compete more effectively. So, Jeff, what are your thoughts on the competition with Starlink in 2024? We saw, the headline deal with John Deere, big in-flight connectivity deals, and we're seeing Starlink have a bigger impact in mobility markets like aviation and maritime. So, Mark mentioned the question about is there enough demand for all these big companies, and how are you watching other operators position themselves to try to get some attention away from Elon Musk and Starlink?
Well, yes. I mean, I do believe there's enough demand for everyone to grow. The question is just how much more or less will they grow and divide this pie with SpaceX and, hopefully someday Amazon. Um, I've seen CAGR forecasts for like the overall markets for operators between like 10 and 18% through 2030, which if you look at the telecommunications industry as a whole, is, I mean, not super exciting, even for Starlink. I mean, most of that growth projection is falling on the middle to lower end of that. So people are expecting maybe like 10 to 14, I think, between now and the end of the decade. Um, but there's enough demand for everyone to do well enough. I would say outside of SpaceX, you have the big global players like Viasat, SES, Intelsat, Telesat, Iridium, Eutelsat, OneWeb, and I think like the long term they'll be fine. As well as like the established regional players like JSAT, Thuraya, Space 42, Hispasat, people have established business, they'll be fine. I think it's like the operators that hover below that group that may struggle, especially ones that are like dependent on getting a lot of new assets in space. I really think that's the key here is that if you have functional assets in space with at least like a 5 year life, there's always going to be a path for you as an operator to profitability because you're up in space. And also, I think there is some innovative value of a multi-orbit offering versus a LEO only system or a GEO only system. I think there's competition out there, and there's a good, strong argument for that business model. I just think Starlink's available now, and they have a jump on the market, and we'll see how that plays out. But I mean, I expect Starlink will remain the leader for a while, with like eventually Amazon as maybe like a close second, but who knows? Um, all we know is really like what Starlink has established already.
Mhm. And I think regional sovereignty is a key point there. The Iris Squared constellation in Europe that SES and Eutelsat are both working on. Not everyone wants to get everything from a US company or to get everything from SpaceX. And like you said, with the regional players as well, companies or countries want secured sovereign access to space. So there's none of these, I don't think any of these companies are going to go away. There's going to be big demand, and it'll be really interesting what happens with the Iris Squared constellation. Um, what specific capabilities go into that and how big of an opportunity that is for the European space industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, connectivity just remains a high demand bread and butter market for a lot of people. And how much it's not that like Starlink dominates the whole entire ecosystem. They're dominant in a lot of areas right now, but there are other markets out there where a multi-orbit system or a geo system or a, you know, LEO MEO system might be stronger. But yeah,
Yeah, that's another important point is it's still kind of early days to see how operators are positioning these multi-orbit solutions. Um, Intelsat is doing the IFC solution with Geo and Leo, but OneWeb is still kind of getting up that like fully entering service. So it's still early days to see like case studies from these situations and um, really how these work. And I think that that's something that the big operators are going to be working out in the next year or so is like how to combine their different technologies together. So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity there.
I'll just add one thing on that. I think one of the things you might see, and this may be an IFC, more IFC related, is you tend to see a little bit of like a herd mentality almost. That if one airline goes in one direction, then a lot of other airlines might sort of follow, and you might see something like this here. This hasn't been the easiest market for airlines to crack. I mean, it's in its second decade, and there's you talk to one airline and you'll get a completely different perspective, even in terms of this whole multi-orbit versus LEO. So what you might see ultimately over the next 2 or 3 years is, that if one of them proves to be more successful than the other, and other airlines see that you could see a big shift. I mean, with Starlink at the moment, it's announced a lot of deals, but we're yet to see really the how that will sort of shake out. And likewise, even with the multi-orbit stuff as well. And I do think that airlines, like a number of industries, they're very, very influenced by their peers. So if it becomes noticeable in 2 or 3 years that one solution, particularly for the global airlines, maybe I mean, there's like low cost regional airlines, and it's a different perspective to like a global airline that's flying all over the world over oceans. But if in 2 or 3 years that you start to see one of these solutions perceived by the airlines to be much better, then I think you could see almost like a herd mentality. I mean, you kind of saw it a little bit with cruise already, and I think you might see it with airlines going forward. So I think that's just one thing to look at, sort of going forward. I mean, I think all of the airlines there, I don't think they're necessarily pro LEO or pro multi-orbit right now. I think they're very much in a prove it to us type mode. They've still, they could still go either way in the future. I don't think they're necessarily married to one technology one way or the other. So I think that's just something that we as an industry will need to be aware of going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sparked my thinking on one thing on cruise. One of the things I thought was really interesting in our conversation with Adele from SES, we asked him about cruise and Starlink, which has been signing all of SES's customers. And he said, they're still our customers. They have both on board. SES is still growing in the amount of capacity that they are serving cruise ships. So these end users, they want more and more connectivity and they need it. In many cases, they might need it from multiple providers.
I think the interesting thing, going back to the airlines, is how many people do you know? And maybe I could ask the two of you this. How many of you have been on a flight and you've tried to get in-flight connectivity and you've not been able to get it for whatever reason. I think most people you talk to will talk about a frustrating experience that they've had trying to connect on an aircraft. And admittedly, I understand that that it's difficult. You're X thousand feet in the air, you're going over oceans. But at the same time, customers are not very forgiving. If you're promising them, a great service, and you're promoting this and you're not able to deliver it, our customers are going to say, well, I know it's difficult because it's on an aircraft and we're way up in the sky. So I think airlines, it has been more difficult from a technical perspective to actually execute on this. And I think one of the big things going forward is which of these solutions will be better from a execution perspective, from a technology where you just go on a flight. Doesn't matter if it's a crowded flight or there's a big game going on during the flight and everybody's connecting, it will just work, and it will just work seamlessly for everybody. And I think that's one of the things to sort of look at going forward, because people want the at-home experience, whether they're on a cruise ship, whether they're on an aircraft now. And that's the airlines talked a lot about better SLAs, more demanding service level agreements. So I think that's going to be something that I think will be more prevalent to the discussion over the next couple of years.
Mhm. All right, I'm going to kick us over to manufacturing. And there were definitely some challenges in this market in 2024. Some of the biggest manufacturers are having a lot of struggles. Boeing Defense and Space, obviously, Boeing, the company, is having bigger problems with, in its plane business, but Defense and Space logged a lot of loss charges this year. Unfortunately, the Starliner spacecraft didn't take the astronauts back from the International Space Station, even though it took them there successfully. And then in October, we saw the Intelsat 33E satellite broke apart in orbit. So there have been reports from the Wall Street Journal that Boeing is even looking at potentially selling its space business. And Boeing's CEO said on the recent call with investors that the company should be doing better in its core area of airplanes and not as focused on outside non-core areas. And then in Europe, Airbus and Thales have been reportedly in talks for a merger, but now the CEOs it's been confirmed, and Leonardo is also in those discussions, specifically to create a bigger space company that could compete better on a global scale. And both Airbus and Thales had layoffs in the space businesses in 2024, and specifically mentioned issues with satellite programs. And maybe they haven't said it's specifically software-defined satellites, but that is part of it, that they're having issues getting the software-defined satellites delivered and to, meet what they said that technology would do. And one kind of bright spot, but a lot of pressure, is on MDA Space, which got the Telesat Lightspeed deal away from Thales. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on them in the next year to execute on Lightspeed and the advanced technology that was promised in that constellation. They're also building Globalstar's upgrade, and Globalstar is now they have another constellation in addition to the upgrade that has not announced a manufacturer. We have to wonder if MDA Space will also build that, or if they're looking at other manufacturers. But a lot of pressure on MDA Space, I think, in the next year.
There is, but it's a nice pressure,
Hmm.
because it's a good pressure because they've won. We've sort of seen the way that the contracts have changed in satellite manufacturing, and they're much tougher now. You don't necessarily, the days of necessarily being sustained by, 4 or 5 big geo orders a year, you're just not seeing those orders. So, you know, the manufacturers almost need this pressure. They need this pressure of getting a deal like Telesat and then executing on the deal. And MDA's done a great job. Obviously, Mike Greenley was our satellite executive of the year. So it was huge for them. I mean, they're a company that is growing, that is been really impressive over the last 2 or 3 years. And And this is the nature of what you're dealing with now. The market has fundamentally changed. I haven't seen any stats over the last few years, but in terms of like, it used to be that we covered geo satellite orders fairly regularly, and you barely sort of see them now. And obviously it's going to have a knock-on effect for manufacturers because this was their business for so long. And so that, they have to be a part of these other programs now. And they have to, and the thing is it almost feels like we've entered sort of almost like an all or nothing stage. You either get all of a contract like MDA did with Telesat, or there's very little left. So, it is going to put pressure on manufacturers. It's kind of a paradox in a way because you're looking at a time where we're putting more satellites up than we've ever put up in history. We're talking thousands, tens of thousands of satellites but we're also talking a time where the manufacturers are under huge amount of pressure that you talk about having to merge, talking about layoffs. It's an incredibly tough um, tough environment just because of the way contracts are structured now and stuff. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think um, you know you want that good pressure. You want that good pressure of a Telesat program that MDA has.
Hmm.
I think to let I think you mentioned, Rachel, something that's really important is the change to software defined space systems. I mean, it makes it super expensive to manufacture. And in a lot of cases, the supercomputing or the high speed computing systems you need for your customers hasn't been perfected or tested yet. So you're still waiting on that. Then you're also looking for the chips that you need to run those systems, which are not available. Um, and so that's one challenge, right? Then you have a lot of these legacy manufacturers that have just simply not adapted to a world of off the shelf customization or commercial off the shelf buying, or now that you have some people who offer the complete stack as a service. They'll build your satellites plus launch. And if you're buying small satellites, that is by far the most economical choice when you don't have to factor in primes and subcontractors. And you're also looking at as Mark mentioned, just the quicker timelines on turnarounds to supply these satellites because the windows are so small. Um, in terms of the mergers, I'm not surprised. Merging the manufacturers isn't a new thing for Europe. This has happened before.
Hmm.
I think it's the smart move. Um, for the United States, it's a little different. Boeing and Lockheed Martin are certainly in a deer in the headlights kind of moment right now. Starliner was bad. That was really bad, right? Like that was the whole argument going into that was we need alternatives for space travel, and it was so public. That's the thing. It
Yeah.
wasn't really like a satellite, right? We were talking about
Hmm.
human spaceflight flight, but it was very, very public and a very public display of SpaceX versus everyone else.
Hmm.
And in the public's eye, SpaceX won, and they're going to have to go retrieve those astronauts, months after they were supposed to be home. So
Yep.
it's tough. I think there's going to be. MDA is kind of an example of a legacy company that has lucked out on maintaining independence, maintaining its core customer base, perfecting that model where it shines, and finding a customer who was right there, right? So I'm sure, and Mike, like the Aurora looks great. They've got innovation. There's some excitement there. So I think they're kind of like a weird case study of how you can survive in this market, but it's tough. Even for all of the small satellite manufacturers, um, you got to compete with that in-house model too.
Yes.
And you
And
know,
in the small satellite market, like Terran Orbital got scooped up by Lockheed, its biggest customer, and they I think they had wanted to remain independent. That's what their CEO had said, and then but financially they weren't able to make it work. And then another aspect of that, kind of on the smaller manufacturers, is some of the geo orders are going to Astranis and Swiss to 12, like not just from
mhm.
kind of non-traditional customers, but Tycom ordered a satellite from Astranis this year, a geo satellite. So
Yeah,
lots of competition in the market, and it's very tough to build satellites today.
and build them fast.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. In launch, every year I do a top launches to watch in the year ahead. And for a couple of years, we had been tracking these vehicles and, oh, they keep getting pushed back, they're getting pushed back. And we finally saw them launch in 2024, which was super cool. So ULA launched the Vulcan Centaur. They've launched it twice, but it is still not yet certified for national security missions. And they had hoped to do two of those by the end of this year. So, it's taking a little more time to get that into full service. And the first Ariane 6 launched, which was critical for Europe. And just last week, the Vega C rocket returned to flight after it took 2 years to get that rocket back in service. And then Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket has not launched yet, but it's what I'm seeing on Twitter is that, they're waiting on that last FAA approval and a couple things. It could go by the end of the year, but maybe early 2025. So lots more movement in new rockets this year than we had seen in previous years. And also saw some issues with the Falcon 9 for the first time in a long time. It was grounded 3 times in 3 months over the summer and into October. And SpaceX also made a lot of progress with Starship this past year and has it looks like the FAA is going to give them approval to increase the number of launches that they can do in 2025. So, Jeff, you and I talked when this was happening with Falcon 9 about the, when the Falcon 9 is the primary avenue of access to space. So, what does it mean when it's out of service? Like, do you think that the groundings woke people up that the space industry is overly reliant on the Falcon 9?
Uh, okay. So if let's say the Falcon 9 for some reason went out of service, I mean, everyone has a panic attack. Everything gets pushed back. Everyone's making phone calls. Um, Widespread panic. Um, and I'm sure some of those people would be asking to be on Starship if that was ready. Um, but to be realistic, I don't think the Falcon 9's going out of service for a
Right,
long
right.
time. I even think it'll serve alongside Starship. There's a market it can address very strongly for a very, very, very long time. Um, in regards to did the groundings wake people up that the space industry is too reliant on the Falcon 9? If SpaceX's first FCC filing for Starlink didn't wake people up about their reliance on SpaceX, I'm not sure anything will. Maybe if Elon's business gets to the point where he decides it's not in his best interest to launch competitors anymore, and either cuts off the supply or just drastically raises prices, maybe that's what wakes people up. But I still think many people are happily reliant and are kind of just like, when you ask them this question, they stick their fingers in their ears and they go, la, 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 I'm fine. But, um, yeah, I mean, they're reliant. Everyone is overly reliant on SpaceX. And that is nothing against SpaceX. It's to their credit that they've
Mhm.
established their business. I think it is a I think it is really a challenge for the industry to say, are we going to really compete with this company or are we just going to act scared? And so far this year, all I've seen is a market that's just scared to compete with this guy. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they love it. I'm sure Gwen loves it. And, it's, yeah. But I do think like before Falcon 9 goes out of service, I think it's more like realistic that SpaceX would just realize, look, we're not getting anything out of launching our competitors. So either cut them off or just raise the prices.
Mhm.
And we'll see what happens. Under launches, I have on my notes here when you asked us like what's going on with the launch industry this year. I wrote down just a few like really quick things. So
Yeah.
like ULA, you think 20 launches next year, Rachel?
No.
20 launches for ULA? That was like cited
No.
in no.
They might say that, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. And then like I have Ariane 6 40% cheaper than Ariane 5. Is that true? Because that's pretty good. That's good cut cost and cut. I mean, it's going to be available. And I'm just wondering if
Mhm.
that's really out there. And also, can it be modified for constellations? Because it's
Yes.
built to like
Yeah.
launch a very small number of satellites, but if it can be modified, then it's got a much wider market. And then finally, like what's going on with New Glenn?
Mhm.
Like, you know, like
It's close. It's close. It's
yeah.
down at the Cape. We've seen the pictures on social media. Um, and it's huge. I think that I'm so curious to see how this disrupts the market. Um, is Blue Origin just going to start launching Kuiper on New Glenn? How quickly will they be able to ramp up? I don't know. I'm so curious to see how New Glenn shakes things up if it does.
I hope it does. I mean, we
Hmm.
need new launchers. We need more
More.
supply.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, this is the time to be a launcher. This is like a time where you have a market there ready for options. And in on my office wall is a clipping from the New York Times coverage of Satellite 2017, where Bezos announced Eutelsat as the first commercial customer. And I'm like, wow, that was 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry,
Uh,
I'm not like being a downer here. I
No,
I
no. I mean,
I
it's
think there's
important.
a lot of opportunity.
Yeah,
It's
but these
just who's
things,
going to take it.
yes.
I'll just add something there. I mean, we saw something previously almost happened like this around a decade ago where Arianespace was dominating the market before sort of SpaceX came in and really, you know, almost like took over the market. And there was the same conversation then. Is this good for the market that the only um, reliable launch vehicle was an Ariane? And then we saw the situation obviously change relatively quickly. It feels like we're in a little bit of a holding pattern right now where um, others are essentially trying to get their rockets up, their act together, however you want to phrase it, and then we'll see then when we have true competition how the market shakes out. At the moment, we're not there yet because everyone is either just launched a vehicle or is in the process of launching their vehicle over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So I think that will be the test. But it's not. I mean, it's not a good thing for the industry to be so reliant on one company, just as it wasn't when it was Arianespace, and it's not when it's SpaceX, because launching is hard. Things can go wrong, and when things do go wrong, um, it has a knock on it reverberates across the whole industry. So it would actually be, I think, much better for the industry to have a multitude of successful, reliable options that go up regularly. And obviously, I think hopefully over the next 2 or 3 years we will see that. Because
Yeah.
I don't think it's good for the industry, to be frank. I mean, it's not necessarily about. I wouldn't necessarily say the industry is playing scared, but it's just, well, you know, people, business models are very, very tough. Making money from satellite isn't easy. So, okay, we've got to get these satellites up as quick as we can in the most cost-effective way we can, and we have to start selling them as quick as we can. So, that sort of drives obviously the decision making process.
Yeah. Um, well, no one has been able to come close to the success of the Falcon 9. That's why it is the leader. SpaceX is launching it every day sometimes. No one has been able to come close to that success. And that's a very difficult thing to do. I don't want us to not mention Rocket Lab, which they have hit a record at 12 electrons this year, and they could still launch more. So, and then their stock price jumped like crazy this year. They finally have broke through and like got market attention that is now resulting in more capital for the company. I think it was in the low dollars early this year, and now their stock is at $24. So huge jump. And then they're working on Neutron, which is a bigger launch vehicle that will be competitive for constellations. But I don't know that we're going to see that vehicle launch in 2025. I don't know the latest on what Rocket Lab has projected there.
But
But
what do you
that's
think, Rachel? Does that come? Do you think is it New Glenn or Neutron? What comes first? As a
Well,
what do you
I mean,
see as
yeah,
a?
it's gonna be New Glenn. Like, I mean, New Glenn is ready. It's there. It's very close. Neutron is still like it's still being built.
I'm just saying, considering the time to how quickly Rocket Lab is able to get into a regular cadence. Like,
Yeah,
do you think we're
yeah.
going to see? Are you going to see like? Are we going to be talking about Falcon 9, then Neutron, or are we going to say Falcon 9, New Glenn, then Neutron
Mm.
next year? Or no, not next year. Maybe how about say middle of 2026? Where are we at?
Yeah, maybe Rocket Lab will be able to scale up Neutron faster, um, than New Glenn will be able to scale. That's possible.
Yeah, it'll be close.
Yeah,
We'll see.
yeah. And then another one, Firefly Aerospace. They raised a big funding round this year, and new CEO Jason Kim from Millennium Space Systems. So it could be interesting to see if Firefly gets a more regular launch cadence. And so there's just a lot happening, and it's interesting. More options for people, but it's all about scaling up and like getting to a better operational cadence.
Yeah. I'll mention Jason and Millennium as a an asset that Boeing has. I know Jason. He's a really smart executive, and if there's anyone that could drive change there, he's one to do it.
At
So
Firefly. Like he's not
and
with.
Firefly, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just saying, like going back to like when we were talking about our
Mhm.
manufacturers,
Yeah.
you know, I should have mentioned them.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just add very quickly. I mean, to be frank, I think we could do a whole podcast on the launch market and easily talk about an hour on this. I think it's one of the most fascinating markets within satellite right now because of the potential change that we might see over the next few years. It kind of reminds me when we were talking about the Leo constellations and like, what's the effect going to be? And it always felt like we were at the start of this era, but then the era was delayed and delayed and delayed. And I kind of feel like launch is a little bit similar. We've sort of been waiting for these
Mhm.
new vehicles to come, and it just feels like the wait has gone on, and we're very, very close now for that wait being over. And then, I think it's going to be a fascinating market for us as editors to cover over the next couple of years. I think there's going to be a lot of movement. I think there'll be some surprises in terms of contracts and things like that we'll
Mhm.
see. I feel like we're sort of, to use a very typical editorial cliche, we're sort of at the calm before the storm right now. But the storm is coming in terms of the storm is coming in terms of launch. I mean, I think we are going to see big things, I think, happen in 2025. I think the holding pattern is coming to an end now, and I think the conversation we'll have at this time next year about launch, I would like to think it will be very, very
Different.
different in tone and nature to the conversation we're having right now.
Hmm. Yeah.
I'll let you two have that conversation. I'm like it for me, watching the launch market is like calling an Uber and seeing the arrival time just continue to go up. It's like, come on, get the car up, get the car here.
Yeah.
Now, and look, that's just really what it is because there's demand and who's going to give you a ride. But one thing also very interesting happening in the launch market is just the talk of alternative propulsions. Like how are we? I mean, how are we going to move from? Are we going to move ever from fuel based, or resource based fuel to some alternatives? Because launching is not the most sustainable thing out
Absolutely.
there.
All right, I've got some rapid fire wrap up questions that to hit you guys with. What was something that surprised you in 2024?
Boy, that's a tough question.
That is kind of tough.
In some ways, um, it was a very sort of predictable year. We didn't really have any consolidation that sort of jumped out or something. You thought, oh wow, this company's bought that company, and that's a little bit out of blue. If I was to mention one sort of surprise, and we didn't really discuss it on the launch, was like the fate of relativity.
Mm,
I think that's a very interesting story because they were, in many ways, the media and investor darlings not that long ago. And I think what happens with them is a super interesting story. So that, in some ways, to me, maybe if I was to highlight potential surprise from this year. Um, I think sometimes even as editors, we get caught up a little bit in the hype sometimes of certain companies. We're very impressed with their CEOs. We see them on stage. We feel like, oh, this seems a company that's really going somewhere, got a really smart business plan. So, and again, not saying that relativity is not smart or anything, but I think it's I think it could also be a little bit of a cautionary tale that for all the optimism and the glass is half full in the satellite industry, it is still very, very difficult to build sustainable, profitable businesses in some of these areas. And I think that's probably just a reminder this year for all the sunny optimism that you see at Satellite and other events that that there will be winners and losers here. Not everyone is, there's going to be some high profile companies that we all thought were great that won't succeed. And I think
mhm.
that's probably just something that I would highlight for this year.
Um, there are a few. I mean, I think SES Intelsat merger actually being a thing was a surprise. I mean, it's always just surprising when two leading players are negotiating a merge. It's very tough to do. But after seeing Viasat, Inmarsat, Eutelsat OneWeb, I mean, it definitely paved the way. Um, Starliner was a surprise. Just
Mm,
I mentioned that before. Uh, Elon Musk's political activity is a surprise, just because we've never seen an executive be so tied to a specific administration. I mean, this industry has been pretty bipartisan for a long time, and that's more or less strategy because you have long government contracts. You want to see those missions continue, but like I don't know what would have been more shocking or surprising, like if Trump or Harris won. I mean, if Harris won, I mean, we'd be talking about it in the same way, but in a different light for SpaceX, right? So that was surprising. Um, I'm also surprised that Amazon's not here yet.
mhm.
I guess this is like 2022 me saying if that's not up and going by 2024, I'll be surprised. So that's surprising to me. Um, I also think, and I know this is a lot of things, but really, this is surprising to me that it's 2024, and I still have and still hear a lot of people in the industry say we need to communicate the value of space to the public.
Mm,
I feel like that window was open when we returned to manned space flight or human space flight to the ISS, but like the public is now getting this kind of we're racing China We're in a race against China, and I can tell you the general public has no interest in racing China. None. They want lower grocery prices. And like the industry needs to do a better job of communicating the direct value of space to the general public, not just the government, not just the US government. I know they're the largest end user in the world. They got to do that, but to the general public, you've got to just say, like, us being in space, there's a benefit. This is what it is directly to you.
I, I just want to add something into you just jogs my mind there, Jeff. One of the things I have been surprised about two things, and they're sort of related. The first one is really the lack of what we're hearing from any of the regional operators right now. I mean, it's at a time where we obviously we talk about the big constellations, we talk about the consolidation, but we're seeing less and less announcements by the regional operators. There's talk of like partnerships with the Leo constellations. I probably was expecting to hear a little bit more from some of them this year, and maybe a more defined um, strategy from some of those going forward, and how they fit into this new world order going forward. So I think to me that has been a bit of a surprise this year. I think one of the other things I will sort of mention is this one does interest me a lot, is the creation of Space 42. It's very clearly called a space and AI company, and I think that is super interesting. One of the things I'm interested about maybe for coverage in 2025 is whether we will start to see, you know, chief artificial intelligence officers become the norm within space companies and things like that. So that's something, I mean, it's not necessarily a surprise, but it's something that I'm sort of looking for. And I think Space 42 was a tremendous, or the RSAT bayonet was a tremendously interesting piece of consolidation, because it was very different from some of the traditional types of consolidation we see, or two similar players get together just so that they can scale up and be more efficient. So I think the regional stuff is very interesting. I mean, I've sort of noticed when looking for press releases that you're with some of these operators now, you're barely seeing them release any press releases a year now, and I think that is you know maybe it's understandable, but it's to me it's still a little bit surprising.
Yeah. My next question, and you guys kind of got into this as well, was what are some of the key storylines that you're watching in 2025? And those were I think those things that were interesting led into that for both of you. For me, Jeff, you talked about the election. That's going to be a key situation, is how that influences decision making, whether that is regulatory policy or government contract decisions in the government with the space industry. How much influence is Elon Musk's Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, going to have? Is SpaceX going to get, is there a risk of overly favorable contracts with SpaceX, with the DoD, just all of these things, how this is going to shake out. And then also, the FCC having Brendan Carr. I know he's been critical of the FCC not putting Starlink in the broadband programs, but is that going to also mean that he's more embraces satellite more overall, which will be very interesting. Um, Not on the political side, and kind of a niche thing that I'm starting to get interested in. And this won't be like a big story in 2025, but the auto market. There were some developments that I've heard about recently in terms of having satellite connectivity in cars as cars move to autonomy. And it's, kind of similar to the agriculture market, but that's something that I'm interested in learning more about in 2025.
Yeah,
Rachel,
and I could tell you that 5GAA, that organization that has been working now more with satellite operators that you've heard about recently, they'll be at Satellite talking about what they're trying to do with that standard um, to get 5G to the automobile. So
Awesome.
that is
Yeah.
kind of interesting. Yeah, that is interesting to see.
Rachel, can I ask you, did anything surprise you this year?
One thing I will say that surprised me is I am surprised every time I see an announcement for a new satellite operator, and we still saw a couple of those this past year. The one that I came off the top of my head is Logos Space, which has like some former Google executives, and they are wanting to launch a constellation for enterprise connectivity. I mean, it sounds like Starlink and Telesat Leo, and I just think to myself, how is there more? How can you be starting from scratch and still getting in the game? But that just shows that we're in the early days of this, and like it's not the players that we have today are not going to be necessarily the same. There's still room to shake things up, but I'm always surprised when I see like a brand new operator say, "Hey, we're gonna get in the game and launch a bunch of satellites."
I can understand that because you kind of feel like it's perhaps you kind of feel like it has a natural endpoint, and you think, well, that endpoint still isn't there because, as you said, there's still companies that are looking to do these things, and you just sort of wonder, okay, where's the gap for you? I mean, it feels like, there's fairly comprehensive solutions out there, and whether we'll see another player that we really haven't heard of now, but in a few years be a big force, that would be, yeah, I'm not surprised. That is quite surprising on a few levels.
I will say this, one segment we haven't talked about during this episode is the ground segment.
Mhm.
And there's a ton of innovation and adaptation happening in the ground systems area, which is also going through its own digitalization revolution going on right now. Interesting, interestingly, when we launched the Startup Space Entrepreneur Pitch Contest at Satellite many years ago now, I think it's like this is our ninth year. Um, like the most common technologies where like we want to launch a new constellation or we want to be a new launch service. And over the past 2 years, the most popular technology by far has been on the ground systems, like the hardware side. And this is where investors are really like putting a lot of money. They want prototypes. They want to see prototypes, and just the work that we're seeing in like multi-orbit, the work we're seeing in space transmissions, optical technology. I mean, it is physics defying stuff, and it's really really exciting. And then at the same time, you have like the legacy ground systems manufacturers just trying to like revolutionize their business model, their interactions with everyone. And you have them like talking about open APIs. Like that's just you don't see that on the terrestrial side at all. And you've got some pretty brilliant minds coming from the terrestrial world into the satellite world to like work on some of these projects. And I think that like that just the conversations that satellite industry professionals are having about standards and multi-orbit capabilities right now is really exciting. As well as the people who are developing antennas in-house for their like LEO only systems. I mean, you're seeing like some real surprises out there that you wouldn't expect. So yeah, just
Yeah.
wanted to give them a shout out because it really is exciting.
Yeah, that's a super important thing to mention. To wrap us up, I mean, I feel more energized about going into 2025 and the awesome things that we'll get to be covering after talking to you guys. And I hope that our listeners do too. So thank you guys for an awesome year at On Orbit. Thank you, Mark and Jeff, so much for sharing your time and having this conversation about where the industry is going in 2025. And I hope that all of our listeners have a great holiday season. And that wraps up our 2024 episodes of On Orbit. Thank you so much for listening to the show this year. We really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great holiday season, and we'll be back in your feed in 2025 with new episodes. Cheers.